Welcome to the SIG Release Deep Dive. I am Josh Berkus, cyclical release team member, former release lead. We have here our panel of people who all work with the build and release tools, which is what this deep dive is going to be about, including Chuck, who's going to talk about all of the tools. Caleb, who's responsible for a bunch of the tools, originally, yeah. Doug, who's been revamping the branch manager process. And so we're going to talk about all of that, about how the actual bits that make up Kubernetes get shipped out the door. So here's our list of topics. We're going to talk about SIG release and the release tools. There's going to be a tour of the release tools. There's going to be sort of a history of how we got the tools that we have now. Talk about how the code, binary release process works, and then what the future is going to be, and then some Q&A. This is a deep dive, so we're specifically focusing on release tools and not on the other things that SIG release does, like mentorship and feature management and all those other things that SIG release also does at different parts of the cycle. Let's get on with the release tools. So, Chuck, you want to go ahead and tell us what tools we have?
Yes. As you may have seen from my bio, I am not actually part of SIG Release, but I will not be talking about the SIG Release process. I'm just going to be talking about the release tooling. And before I get too far into that, I wanted to set a little bit of context. So it's important to know what GCB is. And I think this image sums up what GCB is quite nicely. A ship branded with Kubernetes and packages on it. Now, it's like a managed Jenkins server or a generic build job runner. You can define some YAML, and you can pass that YAML to GCB, and GCB will do whatever your YAML says. And the YAML looks like a list of steps, and each step is a Docker image or a container image with arguments to the container, and it will do something.
And if you're familiar at all with LinuxKit, it's kind of similar to that. There are commands in GCB like bazel. There are Docker commands that's similar that allows you to kind of build up a system or represent your test.
Cool. So we should define what a release is. And the way I think about a release is sort of 5 main components. And the first component is maybe the most obvious are the binaries, the Kubernetes binaries that get distributed, building the binaries from a specific commit and putting them in a well-known place that people can find them. Secondly are the container images that contain those same binaries that are also pushed to a registry so that people can find those and use them and consume them. Third are the release notes. Very important part of the release process is to build a list of things that have changed since the previous version to let people know what they have to do to upgrade their Kubernetes, or what features have been added or deprecated, and other exciting news about Kubernetes. Fourthly is communication. Very important part of release is to let people know that to let people know that the release has actually happened. So an email goes out to probably a couple of Google groups, maybe a Slack notification, but it's important to let people know that a release is done. And then lastly, there are the Linux packages, so the Debian packages and the RPMs pushed to an upstream repository that users can add that repository to their system and then install Kubeadm, kubecontrol, the kubelet, and those are tools that will help them install Kubernetes. And so those 5 things make up a Kubernetes release. But that's a lot of things to manage. And so there's a tool. One of the first tool I want to talk about is Anago. And that's a release tool. It's a couple thousand lines of bash found in Kubernetes/release. And it helps manage almost all of these things. So it helps manage the first 4, and we'll talk about the Linux packaging in a little bit. So we have a tool, Anago. We run it on our laptop. It pushes a bunch of stuff to a bucket, right? That's not quite right, because we don't actually want to build anything on our laptop and depend on hardware that one person has. So of course, we want to actually do that all in the cloud, and this is where Google Cloud Build comes in, because that's going to be the platform to build these things, push them to the correct place. And actually, we have another tool, the second tool I want to talk about, GCB Manager, actually wraps the entirety of Inago, so you don't actually have to run Inago by itself. You run GCB Manager. That will generate the correct commands for you, and then also give you a nice interface to GCB. It'll let you list recently run jobs. You can see the status, and you can tail the logs of jobs in case you need to debug any issues that may arise. And the last thing, Linux packaging, actually the build process for that depends on Kubernetes being released. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, or rather a dependency graph. But you have to first release Kubernetes, and then you can build the Linux packaging because it actually goes to those well-known locations where the binaries live to download and package them up. And actually, this is used quite a lot by SIG cluster lifecycle. This is sort of our desired path for getting a best practices Kubernetes cluster installed. And the packages are Kubeadm, kubelet, kubecontrol, and a couple of dependencies, Kubernetes CNI and cry control, which is just an interface to a container runtime instead of if you don't want to use Docker. But those are the tools that we have available in Kubernetes release. And for the release process, I think Doug here is going to talk about that.
Hi, everybody. My name's Doug MacEachern. I think, oh wait, this is history. This is Caleb's. Okay, back to you, Caleb.
No worries. Hey, I'm Caleb Miles. I'm a technical program manager at Google. So the history. I think SIG release and the release process is one of the clearest examples of the fact that we, as a community, we're really standing on the shoulders of giants. Chuck got into Inago a little bit, but at least for me, Inago really is, it's a checklist, right? So 1,000 lines of bash. It is among the best bash I've ever seen. It's like well factored. It's broken into multiple what you would consider modules, but it is a checklist of steps that you would have to go to. Checklists have resulted in many industries, medicine and aviation being the primary examples, becoming much safer over time and reducing kind of the ability for humans to miss a step in a complex sequence is really helpful. Inago automates most of that and also tells you where it is. Over the course of the years, people have added the ability for Inago to be reentrant, and that's also great. But looking back to where we started, so this comes directly from the release instructions for prior to 1.4. So if you notice here, it says releases are cut directly from master. You can imagine some challenges with doing that, especially for a project where you have over 1,000 committers trying to push changes. Cutting release now would have to block the entire running of the whole program. And so that's not great. It also means that it's very difficult to kind of move. As a release manager, it's difficult to know kind of where your sources of change are coming from if you can only release and push to master. So now we've got release branches that allows us to more carefully move changes from master to the release branch as we have more confidence in the stability of master. So it really gives the release team a lot more tools to be able to manage the release safely. So you can read this; it's fun, or you can go back to the the Git history and SIG release repository, Kubernetes SIG release, if you will. Yeah. Either, it's fine. Yeah. Yeah, there. Okay. Yeah, we'll get to it. But yes, a human does end up cutting the branch or using the tool to cut the branch. But we'll get into that later. The instructions go on. So one, you notice here that the ability to even see what the status of the release was only limited to Googlers because it was a Jenkins instance that you needed a Google account to be able to access. We have done lots and lots of work as a community, as Google specifically, to open up these roles to other people in the community to really make it a community-driven process. So this is really all for your historical edification. You can read the slide on your own. There's not much to say other than it used to be a Google-only show. It no longer is, and that is thanks to the incredible work done by our engineering productivity team at Google. So thank you to the entire team. Wouldn't be able to do it without you.
All right. Thanks. Hey, it's Doug again. I'll actually talk this time. I wanted to give kind of a brief overview of the branch manager role and my experience with it in the past 2 releases. So kind of the overview that I had gotten from Tim when he voluntold me that I would be the branch manager. The kind of the basic responsibilities. One is actually cutting the releases. So the tools that Chuck and Caleb were talking about are used for that. And it's all of the release types: alpha, beta, RC, official release, and there's kind of a preset schedule for all of those, although it's subject to some change. And once the releases actually go out, sending the notification to the Kubernetes announce and the developer group, and that's actually, I'm sure most of you have probably seen that. It's essentially the generated changelog for the current release. The other responsibilities, so once we actually create the release branch, so for the alpha releases, it's all alpha master. Once the release branch is created, we're doing daily syncs from the master branch to the release branch, and the tool is called branch FF, and that happens before code freeze. And then once code freeze actually happens, then, or after code freeze is lifted, there's no more fast forwarding. Master's kind of wide open to all the stuff that's been waiting to come in for the next release, and only cherry picks are done to the release branch. And then there's other aspects to the role. So there's definitely providing some assistance with code reviews, especially towards the end. If there's CI failures, trying to jump in and help debug those issues. And it's kind of all hands on deck, but just kind of doing what you can to chip in. So from my experience stepping into the role, before I spoke with Tim, I had no experience with the Kubernetes release or SIG release. Pretty new to Kubernetes in general. And Tim had told me that I would be the first non-Google branch manager. It had been Caleb for a number of years. I actually went back through because the GitHub SIG release repo has the release teams for all the releases, and I went back and kind of verified that. And as a side note, I saw in release 1.6 there was a spiritual advisor role, and I don't know why that's not there anymore. Maybe we could bring that back. There was kind of an effort that started around July 2018 to create role handbooks for each of there's 10 roles, or 11 if you include the Kate's robot. But going into 1.12, there was no handbook for the branch manager. And so what we had gotten from Caleb was this, what's actually still described in the repo as old Anago doc. Not just old, but old. And it's a bit outdated. You can still look at it today. There's a ton of stuff with strike-throughs. There's internal references. I like this one to Kubekins. I'm pretty sure that's Jenkins something or other. But there's some kind of neat history in that document if you're interested. So I had been joining the release team meetings. Another thing Tim told me early on was that the first couple of weeks branch manager doesn't need to do anything because there's not an alpha until 3 or 4 weeks in. So I was at the meetings. I was paying attention. I might have been multitasking a little bit, but I remember the one meeting. I think it was Aish that said, "So Doug, are we ready to cut the alpha today?" And I was like, "Yeah. Let me just go read through that document from Caleb." And then I ended up, and I didn't want to bug you, Caleb, because you might have. Well, yeah. So he wasn't really that reachable. But then finally, what I found was the release repo with all the tooling, and and we'll get into that a little bit. But kind of when it came time to cut the release, this is what I was feeling like. And I know it's kind of a tired meme, but there's no better way to describe it. I just didn't know what I was doing. Tim and I did a Zoom, and there were the shadow roles, and I said, well, Tim, should we invite the shadows? And Tim was like, well, let's figure out what we're doing first. So kind of the light for me was the K-release repo, and the other guys mentioned there's a lot of bash code in there. I actually ran the line of code program on it. There's 4K lines in the repo, but 2.5K are comments. And every one of these tools, branch FF, GCB manager, all have a -man, -help option that spits out a manual. So that's where it was kind of like in the, in the movies, with the light. And that's really, it kind of had everything that we needed to get started. And, we still weren't sure exactly what was going to happen, how it was going to go. There were a couple of bumps with like permissions and that kind of stuff. But, again, the docs, and I agree that the bash code is very well written in there. So that's was a great way to start. So kind of getting back to part of your question a little bit, releases and tags. So again, all the releases are created by Anago. How do you pronounce it? Is it Anago? Okay. We never mentioned Anago in the release meetings via GCB manager. So, and I wanted to point out these tags because this is actually a question that also came up even towards the end of the 1.13 release from people on the release team. But when you create the official release, so when the 1.11 official release was cut, the v1.12.0 alpha.0 tag is created. And it's really nothing more than a tag. There's no release associated with that, but it's just kind of marking that point in time that from that tag is where we're going to start the 1.12 release from the master branch. And then, if you look at one of the schedules, we usually plan at least 2. I think there were maybe 3 alphas in the past release. And those are all kind of incremented automatically by GCB manager. There's some metadata that gets stored in Google buckets somewhere. That is kind of the last release. But it's one of those areas where there's not really any room for human error. It's kind of automatically incremented, which is nice. And then when it comes time for beta, that's when the release branch is actually created. So it'll be called release dash, whatever the version number is. So release 1.12 in this case. And then when you do that, you get another automatic tag, beta.0. And we have a couple scheduled beta releases, 1 through N. And then there's release candidates. And then finally, there's the official release. And then after the official release goes out, this is actually one of the questions that came up was once 1.13 was tagged, someone noticed there was a 1.13.1-beta0 tag. And I haven't really seen any beta releases of patch versions, but the same mechanism is there if it needs to be used. But otherwise, you just see the major version .1 through N number of patch releases. So after we made it through 1.12, you go. Well,
Yeah, so there you can change up the order a bit. So when I am the branch, or the times I had served as the branch manager, I would cut the release branch and then cut alphas from that. The tool does all the auto incrementing. The tool also gates on the status of the CI. So it's you are as the branch manager are deciding more or less to bless a SHA. And so the SHA you bless becomes that, that beta or the alpha or the release candidate. and more changes will come in. Generally, you will either, depending where you are in the release cycle, you either will just fast forward those from master, or you will cherry pick those on from master. There is a release x.y branch that is branched off of master, and that's the branch we are going to be stabilizing through the course of the release cycle. That gets created. You can decide. There's a little bit of flexibility when you want to create it, but you either can create it. You can either do everything, cut everything off of the release master branch if you're fast forwarding every day. It doesn't really matter, but it's just exactly. But it's a place where you can start that stabilization work. So before code freeze, it's really up to you because you're doing daily fast forwards. So you didn't need to necessarily make the branch. You could cut everything from master, but yeah.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the other reason for doing that is for CI, especially once the release tag is created. So there's separate CI jobs that are tracking the release branch. So we can kind of stabilize that through the first couple of betas before we get into doing RCs. Yeah, I'm going to tell our story coming up here. So after 112, and Tim and I had done these kind of builds through Zoom, or at least we would start that way. And I should mention the builds take hour and a half, 2 hours to complete. So we weren't hanging out for that long, as much as I like you, Tim. But just kind of pasting, the kind of status of the logs. And Tim created the branch manager handbook from those sessions, so it's kind of really well documented now. And then through the 113 release process with Aish leading, we actually had a good process with the shadows and Hannes. I don't know if Hannes is here, but he's the next branch manager, and he's all ready to go. So hopefully he'll have some pictures other than the I don't know what I'm doing dog next year. We talked about doing a demo, but again, for actually doing a full build takes a really long time. So I kind of put a snapshot in here of a couple of the commands. So GCB manager stage, and you give it if this was an alpha, you'd actually say, so the first argument's the branch. So for an alpha, that would be master, but everything else, it's the release branch. And then there's a couple of flags, in this case, official. So this is actually the log from doing the 113 official build. There is a mock mode for doing builds, and that's the default. And if you want to do an actual build, then you have to pass a no mock flag. And then build ahead, I'll actually explain that a little bit later. So once you actually start this thing, it's running a job on GCB, and then the output is going to be the next command that you see here. You can run GCB tail with the job ID, or there's also a console that you can kind of follow along. And there's quite a bit of output, so I put just kind of a super whittled down version here. But kind of, the things that I was looking for when I'm doing this are seeing that the release version is what I'm expecting. And it actually outputs some of the flags that you put in, whether it's a no mock or official build or RC. And actually that came in handy because when I went to do the 113 official build, I forgot no mock. So I just canceled the job and started again. So it goes through, checks some prerequisites. So this is where early on, I didn't have the right permissions for some things, and it would fail at that point. And there's a couple of checks, GCB-related checks, disk space, and then it's actually tagging the tree locally. And then it kicks off what takes probably the longest is actually doing the cross-compiling of all the components. And I included my favorite architecture because I love mainframes, the S390. But you're going to see this for every architecture. And then the release notes are generated. They're actually stored in one of the GCB buckets, and those are used for a couple things. One, I mentioned the notification. And then eventually those actually get posted back into GitHub. And then staging the source tree, when the releases that are on GitHub include a tarball of the release, the source code, and then actually pushing binaries to GCB buckets. And then the most important part of the output of this log from the staging is the next command, GCB release, and it actually outputs the exact command that you can just copy and paste to kick off a release. So as far as room for improvement from my observations, I don't know if you mentioned it up here, if it was before a talk, but the debs and RPMs are still built by Google, so that wasn't something that branch manager is able to do outside of Google. The GCB permissions are a little bit limited, and this is where Dims and I had worked through an issue where Dims and I forget who else you were working with, but had modified the there's a cloud, there's an image for actually building all the stuff. There's a Docker file in the release build, and there's a new Docker feature to publish manifests. And so Dims had kind of made changes locally, but he didn't have permissions to actually run through this whole tool chain. So I had to do it, and it didn't work. Right. Yeah, so that was kind of how we had to do it. And then, with the limited access to the logs, Dims couldn't actually view the logs. So I'd have to, copy and paste those. So we eventually worked through it, and I think, the other issue there that we were talking to Caleb about was, kind of randomly updating that build image is kind of a security concern. And then also, all the patch releases are using the same build image. So if somebody happened to want to do a patch build while we're in the middle of this, then that's going to be an issue. Another one that I ran into on my first day on the job was with sending the release. So the release tools have a reference to, the release notify uses user sbin sendmail, which of course isn't sendmail, it's postfix. Does anybody use local MTA to send email these days? Raise your hand. Okay, 1, 2, maybe. Except if you look in the code, it says if hostname ends with google.com, exit 1, sendmail is not available at Google. So anyway, I went to send the email. I realized it bounced. I hadn't touched an MTA in years. I did have a local copy of the email, which was raw HTML, and I'm kind of, it's in the evening. I had my kids kind of screaming at me at home. And I just pasted the email into Gmail and sent it, and then was like, oh crap, it escapes all the HTML, and it looked horrible. And but this is where And there's actually a little note that there's a GitHub issue that because of the having to expose the release process, like wanting to empower the community to release. So there is a GitHub issue that gets created as well with the contents that should be that email. So you can copy it from the GitHub issue into the Gmail and do the email and send it that way. Right. But there's like a tiny little note at the bottom of 10,000 lines of scroll out. Right. So yeah, so there's other ways to do it, but that was also kind of my, I'd had a positive experience with the community all along, but that was one where I'm like, man, I can't even send an email. Everybody's watching. But everybody was actually really, really helpful. I got lots of emojis. I said, I guess SIG release channel gets the most. It's kind of feel good all around. The other issue, which I kind of was another thing with working with Dims through that issue was, he had changes to the Kubernetes release repo, but actually trying to test that with his branch before merging it into release master was challenging. And we kind of figured out how to do that, but I think that's something that could at least use some more docs. The scariest one for me was GitHub permissions, and this is kind of, to be able to upload releases and do the tags and all this stuff. Branch manager ends up with admin permissions.
So that's actually when things go wrong. So a few releases back, when we were still developing GCB Manager, I actually managed to break it, and I had to do all of the last steps myself. So that's why the branch manager retains the high level of permissions in case the tooling itself is unable to make the release. But the tooling can do all of those. It actually has those permissions as well, and one day, hopefully, no one will need those anymore.
Awesome. Well, in the meantime, this image here is what I would see if I went to review a Kubernetes PR, that doesn't have an LGTM yet. There's jobs failing, but still as an administrator, you may merge this pull request. So anytime I'm reviewing, I'm hands up because I don't want to hit the mouse by accident. And the other one I mentioned earlier, there was a flag for the build at head, or I forget the name of it now, but by default, the release tooling still goes and checks an old Jenkins to find a green build. So that kind of needs to be updated to the modern stuff.
It's looking for 3 green builds in test grid, and if you know Aaron from SIG Beard, he will give you lots of color about why that process generally does not succeed. So it should work in theory. It just it is very difficult to get enough green runs for all green runs. For all the tests that would nominally be blocking without having a human having to define the actual state. There's lots of challenges there, but yeah, that's what you see there. That's the fine green build. It is trying against an actual test grid instance, but the green builds are hard to find.
Okay, so actually I should have let you keep the microphone.
I mean, this is really just reckless speculation. Before joining Google, I worked at CoreOS on the same stuff. Since joining Google, I've continued on the mission to help SIG Release and the release team be a fully community-managed effort. And so that's just going to be more work there. So it's helping to support the building of DEBs and RPMs by anyone. There's going to be a lot of work there if you're interested. I talked to Dims about joining the infrastructure working group. It's just making every process should be doable by anyone in the community properly trained. And so that's what we're working on. You can ask me questions about the things I'd like to do or would like to do as a community, or I could just sit here and riff. But
We seem to have a fair amount of questions, so here, we're going to go ahead.
Yeah, so, hello, can you hear? I don't know if this is on or not, but what's sort of the vision? Is it automation so that you rely less on managing, more on engineering the builds? Is that the ultimate vision, or just curious from SIG?
Yeah, so I take my experience as a software developer from Pivotal with me. Building Cloud Foundry, a similarly complex project. I was a Bosch engineer for like 3 years. It was a lot of work, a lot of investments in continuous delivery. Open sourcing that kind of work, or doing that similar kind of work in the open. Like, we don't have a concourse for the Kubernetes project. Prow is a great tool, but it is not that yet. And so, yes, I do imagine we're going to have, applying more pipelining, more continuous delivery to the release. And so, I've always believed that you should be able to go find a screen somewhere, look left to right, and as you are moving left to right, you see more and more confidence as you're sweeping. That's the place I'd like for us to get. We're not quite there yet. It's gonna be a big lift. So if you have experience in release engineering or continuous integration delivery tools, we can definitely use your help in SIG Release or in SIG testing.
Okay. Do we have more questions?
Okay.
So one thing that we need help. One thing we need help is reproducible builds. If anybody else does the exact same build using the exact SHA that we use, you should get the exact same images and binaries. So we are in the process of doing that. So you should be able to build this within your own organization. And yes, Zach.
Sorry, I was going to ask a question, so it's going to interrupt your statement.
That's fine. I have other things to say, but we can.
Well, in the build and release process, I was curious to Hi. In the build and release process, I know we produce like debs and RPMs, and we also produce Docker containers that are pushed to GCR, right? Okay. I don't know if it has like support for Docker Content Trust or Notary.
Yeah, that's
That-
on my list.
Okay, I
Yeah.
was gonna say that'd be a perfect way to like get all this
Okay.
verification.
So we, first of all, we need community accessible repositories for GCR and GCS. So we can push binaries from all the projects, not just the main KK, to the GCS, staging areas or whatever, right? Binaries, release binaries. And then we have to work on GCR, so people doing a cloud provider or a cluster API should be able to push by themselves, without having to need Google credentials or find a release manager. So we might end up even automating that by saying that this is a SHA, this is the version of the container that needs to be published and pushed. So we'll have to end up at that point. And we need to make sure that we can do the Docker Trust stuff and whatever else is coming down the pike for CRI. We don't know what that's going to look like. So we'll have to accommodate that. But the first point is to get the infrastructure out from Google into CNCF, and that's one of the teams that we have separated out as a working group. And I would like help doing that. It's the Kate's Infra, K8S Infra team. You should be able to see it on Slack. So join that, please, and then we have a meeting every 2 weeks, and we are working on GCS, GCR, also clusters for publish bot, and DNS kind of stuff. So there's plenty of work that needs to be that we need to do there for automating all the things that is currently under Google in the Google Cloud. But we want to. It's still going to be in the Google Cloud, but it's going to be in the CNCF sponsored area. So, and that's where we need a lot of help.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the day where no one emails, Slacks, or messages me about needing to get added to the GCP project for releasing. I can see it over the horizon. It's going to be wonderful.
And with that thought, I think we're out of time. So thanks, everybody. If you have more questions about this, SIG Release on Slack. Yeah.